Hello and welcome to the Good Growth Podcast. On this month's episode, our focus turns to one of the biggest television networks in the UK, ITV, looking more specifically at their online streaming service, ITV Hub. Now, nearly every single one of us at some point would have encountered and watched ITV programmes, and over the last decade, an increasing amount of our engagement with ITV programming has been online, whether streaming live or watching on demand. ITV's video on demand service, ITV Hub, initially launched in 2008, and over time it's faced an increasing competition for viewer attention on a global scale. Think Amazon Prime, Netflix, Disney Plus. So, with me to talk about how ITV Hub responds and adapts and continues to thrive is their head of product, Stuart Jones. Stu, welcome.
Hiya, how you doing?
Yeah, very well. Good to have you on. The ITV Hub is very much your sort of baby, isn't it? You're the head of product. You're responsible for a lot of the content that goes on there. Can you just give us a little bit of an overview of what your role entails?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's certainly, the product I've got a vested interest in. I think it's such an accumulative effort, the ITV Hub as well, and I think more so than any other place I've worked, there's been that investment from every area, in terms of technology and design. There's a kind of real kind of family orientation around the ITV Hub and incrementing it into hopefully the success that people see it as today. I took over from a product management role and head of product management role probably about 2.5 years ago, getting on for 3 years now. And, I inherited a kind of really good kind of motivation, and there's some good inertia behind progression and wanting to change the customer experience of the hub. And I came in at a fortunate time when I was there to kind of ensure that the designs and the implementation of the customer experiences were kind of rolled through across all of our platforms as well. And so it's been a really interesting 3 years, and we are still kind of evolving. And I think as the landscape evolves and the VOD strategy, we constantly have to try and look around our purpose and our position in the market and how we're perceived by our customers as well. So that's predominantly my role, is to make sure that between myself, my team, and the supporting teams that we have as well, that we're focused very much on trying to ensure the customer and business values are achieved via the ITV Hub.
And you touched on it at the start there. There's a bit of a family feel, I suppose, about in terms of the input towards ITV Hub and ITV as a general. I suppose part of that, does that come, would you say, from the sort of the history of ITV, with it being such a long-standing company?
I think it is, yeah. And I think there's also, there's people there that have been across almost every iteration of the hub. And so what we have there is a lot of passion and desire for success. I think the challenge that we all face is actually what is our intended outcome and desire for the platform. And I think as we've kind of moved through that, I think there's been a lot of discussion around how we kind of augment content and trying to make sure that we fulfill on not just the kind of customer remit, but also the business remit, and also the public remit as well, of trying to ensure that we are a pillar of the community when it comes down to video on demand platforms in the UK.
That legacy certainly carries through with ITV, and of course, historically, it's a linear broadcast, it's analog. Obviously one of the first television channels around. So, for such a large organisation to have had to make that transition, into offering an on-demand digital product must have been pretty challenging, I'd have thought, for the business at the time.
I think this is where the evolution comes in for us, because the hub, when it started, was seen as an opportunity to ensure that people caught up on content they'd missed. And the problem with linear was always that if you missed that one episode and you didn't have the VHS in to record, or later, you forgot to press this kind of the record button on other devices, you kind of had nowhere to go. And so the service was really born out of how can we ensure that people can watch content they've missed. And so we predominantly became a catch-up service, and that's very much how we were seen. And our depth of content kind of reflects that when you look at kind of some of the other players in the market. And so to come from that place of saying, like, how can we be the experience to the customer who's missed the TV program that they wanted to watch on TV, you kind of start on a slightly different foot. Then our legacy in that area has meant that we've gone through a change that Netflix and Amazon Prime haven't, where we've actually started to try and think about what are the changing customer journeys now in a modern landscape for VOD. And that's where we've kind of come back in and said, okay, let's kind of reevaluate what our kind of definition of a service is, and let's see how we can really make sure the customers are getting what they need from that service as well. So that's really been the evolution over the last several years.
And like you say, you've been in the role about 3 years or so. So obviously, when you came in, ITV Hub was it's a well-established platform. What was your view of it when you came in, and how did you think you could improve it and shape it?
Yeah. So I mean, I was an advocate of ITV, and in the way that ITV probably didn't like, in a sense, in that I watched the football international matches and I watched the kind of standalone content. I wasn't a big entertainment follower, so I wasn't watching the sort of X Factors or Love Islands. They didn't appeal to me personally. So the platform for me, I was kind of a target audience for them to try and grow. They wanted to grow the demographic like myself to watch more content. So what was good for me was I was able to come in with that mindset and think, if I was this customer, I wanted to come and discover this content, how would I go about it? And so I think the design team had done a phenomenal job of sort of making sure the evolution of the customer experience was there. I guess my take and my angle on this was trying to think about it from the end-to-end customer experience as a kind of segment that ITV were chasing, but also to ensure that this, as a key remit of a product manager, is to make sure that the business value is being derived from that as well. So we have I used to work at Channel 4, and so I've come in from the back of knowing what these challenges were from an AVOD platform, in the sense that a customer will always say that they want less adverts, and they will always say that they don't want to be interrupted by any upsell. And that's kind of one of those key business drivers for us. So for me, it was kind of, how do we try and fit this experience in? One of the levers I don't pull is the volume of advertising that we've got, because there's substantial revenue tied into the distribution of advertising on the platform. But the levers I do have to have are kind of how we can make sure that customer experience is as good and as seamless as possibly can be, to make advertising a tolerable, if not enjoyable, experience for people as well. So that was the angle that I was kind of coming in to look at. And like I said, what I don't do is a head of products, and I don't think a product manager should do, is be almost the gatekeeper to design and experience. We have to foster that way of working collaboratively, and we have to try and make sure that the decisions that we make are based on business prioritization and trying to ensure that what the customer gets is what they require, but also adds up to that business goal. But we work incredibly closely with design teams to make sure that overall experience is the one that is fit for purpose. So that was really the culture that I was trying to bring in when I joined.
Yes, it's fascinating hearing you talking about the sort of culture you want to bring in. I'll probably touch on that in a little bit, because it's very sort of customer-centric language, and it's all about the customer experience and fitting the business priorities around the customer experience, rather than the customer experience fitting around the business objectives as such. Just before I come on to that, though, a couple of things really. We've touched on that competition that ITV Hub now has. You're not just competing with the traditional guys like BBC, Channel 4, etc., your terrestrial TV competitors. There's those global streaming services. What's the challenge in terms of positioning and in terms of competing for that?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is that there's very different business models inside Netflix and Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime have got their £79 subscription fee, which ties in a lot of their services into that as well. And lots of people get Prime by virtue of having the necessity to get next day delivery. And that's a completely different business model. And theirs is much more about delivery of anything, as opposed to purely just content and entertainment. Netflix are operating a subscription model only, and they have a phenomenal budget to be able to sort of spend £1 billion on AI, which they famously did back in 2018 as well, to try and increase the personalization experiences that they've got. So the important thing is to try and retain the sense of purpose, and be more than TV. Is very much ITV's purpose and mission. And so we are trying to not just be a place and destination to consume content, but the brand and the representation of that brand is really important as well. And so we want to make sure that our programming is given the kind of stellar experience, and is made sure that people kind of see the true value of a program through an on-product customer experience. But we also have to try and make sure that we kind of balance the remit of the nation as well, if that's not too grand a term to say, and make sure that we reflect that. And they're the kind of Netflix and Prime don't necessarily see the necessities and the importance of that perhaps in the same way, because they are global. Being a UK predominant business, what we want to try and do is speak to the UK population and give them an experience that is reflecting of that mood. And so we have different types of objectives, if you like. But that's not to say we don't look at the likes of Netflix and Prime and Disney Plus now as well as competition, because it's all about eyeballs and consumption of your free time. But then we extend that to the likes of TikTok and Instagram. There's different types of consumption of media within a segment that we're really interested in pursuing. And it's not about trying to, make a program that's going to stop people from using TikTok, because that's just kind of almost an impossibility. It's about trying to find ways in which the experience can entice people in and give that sense of what the consumer is looking for on a platform like TikTok, and create an experience with content potentially on a platform like ITV Hub. And we're not there yet, because we've new challenges present themselves every day. But that's how we kind of start thinking about how we can sort of resonate with the younger demographics. Let's see how they're consuming content, and let's see if we can better that, or it can inspire an idea that we can try and influence people in a different way.
Super interesting. You could expand your competition out into so many things if you wanted to, but also you can use that competition actually to your advantage. And how can we utilize those services to improve our own sort of content and voice? So you talked earlier about you ask customers what they want, less adverts. So ITV now actually offers that in terms of you have ITV Hub Plus, which is of course an ad-free service, and now is a direct revenue source for you from your viewers. Can you just talk to us a little bit about ITV Hub Plus and the sort of demographics that perhaps it's currently appealing to, and where you're trying to go with it?
Yeah, sure. So it kind of came about through, again, listening to the customers and listening to those kind of feedbacks. And there is definitely a group of people who were very interested in paying money to not consume the adverts. The challenge in the balance is always going to be that the ad market fluctuates. And so the cost of an advert at a certain time, is never static, which means that what's challenging with a static price point for something like Hub Plus is we've got to always trying to weigh up the kind of value of that for us. And so there's a clear correlation between the more ads we show, the more interest in Hub Plus, the more kind of content orientated around trying to binge that content, and Love Island's a good example of that, then people consume Hub Plus. Now, we had it wasn't just an ad-free proposition before this year. We were able to consume content abroad. That was another Hub Plus offering, is that you could watch abroad. And the reason for that was because we again knew there was people who wanted to watch that content out of the country, but there was an overhead on us to be able to provide that service. So therefore, we saw this as an opportunity to use that revenue to improve that service of being able to watch abroad. The EU regulations that came in following Brexit have meant we're not able to do that anymore. So as a service, we have to try and look at ways in which we can maximize that opportunity and potential, and try and upsell in kind of different ways. And downloading content is a way that we've tried to do that as well. So the service is there because it fits into the kind of demographic of people who don't want to consume adverts, and also watch a lot of VOD content as well, because the adverts are still there when they're watching simulcast or live stream content. So for us, it's a really positive story. It's a really great story. The numbers are kind of reflective of that. The opportunity is there to increase it further as well, because we see the demand. And I think the richer our content becomes, and the more opportunity we've got to try and maximize the kind of binge culture with that content as well, we're going to see an uptick hopefully in that area.
Absolutely. We're covering quite a lot of topics here, so we'll dive. No, it's really good. We'll dive into culture, the sort of culture that you've adapted, I suppose, and brought in your role as head of product. So we've talked there to that sort of around that customer centric approach. How have you evolved and innovated that approach to, and what kind of culture changes have taken place since you've been there?
I've tried to sort of join dots together, you could say. I think, again, when I came into ITV, I was positively surprised by the wealth of customer insight we had. We have a fantastic customer research team, and they're dedicated to asking customers questions around what the service should be. And I literally came in at the point where I think it was in my first, if not my first day or my first week, where there was customer research sessions taking place. And it was great to see, because I've worked in so many companies that talk about customer research but don't actually follow through on it or see the value. And I think one of the cultural changes I tried to make was the usage of that research. because it's one thing to ask customers and get their insight, but it's another thing altogether to take that back into the experience. And it wasn't necessarily that it was being ignored. It was more maybe the kind of questions we were asking were broad questions, and what we needed to do was focus on more myopic and ask some very specific questions about certain things. There's the age-old adage as well, that customer will tell you one thing but do something different. So what we had to try and do is understand whether the pain point was real and genuine, and data was enabling us to do that. So really the culture I was trying to focus was to try and say, let's take the information and let's better use that with data to try and understand what we are actually learning from the questions that we're asking. I think though the biggest change I was trying to make was to try and move product management away from product ownership. And by that I mean product ownership is a role that you play with inside the Scrum team, and it shouldn't be all encompassing. The product manager role is the product manager is the job, and the role is the product owner. And so the amount of time that the product owners were spending on a delivery with a delivery mindset meant there wasn't the opportunity to think about how the customer and the data kind of relates. And so my kind of constant task, I think, over the last 2.5 years has been to try and move away the perception of product management as being a product owner role that is predominantly played in Scrum, and is much more about working day to day, hour by hour with a development team, but instead trying to treat that as a role that's played with inside Scrum. And the product management job is one where discovery takes place. So it's really trying to shift that balance away from being a kind of using our time to 1 day a week of discovery and 4 days a week to support delivery and engineering questions and functions, to shifting that the other way around, to try and get it to be more of a kind of 70-30 split in favor of doing more discovery work.
Yeah, so I guess in simple terms, so more strategic and thinking rather than necessarily just delivery and doing. So, and just to sort of bring good growth into this, we've sort of been working with you on, I know, a number of sort of insight and innovation aspects with you. How has good growth helped in achieving this sort of viewer-led mindset?
Yeah, it's been brilliant, because it was bringing in the subject matter expertise and the maturity around experimentation that allowed us to sort of learn from good growth. So that was always a key big win for us. But secondly, to understand the value of the experimentations and the tests that we were doing as well, because it's back to that point about, if we haven't got time to really focus on experimentation and testing, then we really don't have time to evaluate what's important for our business and for our customers. And so what good growth did was they kind of augmented our knowledge in the area, and they also helped us with that sort of cognitive capacity. The one thing I was really keen to not do was just say experimentation is done by somebody else, because in that moment you kind of outsource one of the fundamental insights that a product management team have, which is experimentation and knowledge about the success or failure rates of something. What was much more beneficial was to utilize the experience inside good growth, which has been phenomenal, to better help us to be better product managers, if you like, by giving us that kind of time, space, and the cognitive capacity to think about experimentation, but also to help us support us in asking the right questions when it came down to it as well. And as an aside, also the kind of technical experience and implementation of that meant that our own engineering teams weren't necessarily consumed by an experiment or test. So it's really helped us culturally to think about experimentation, and it's also helped us tactically to think about how we can accelerate the speed of that as well.
And can you just give any specific examples, I suppose, of where perhaps this sort of change in culture has actually been successful, and any examples of what you've achieved with that?
Yeah, I think to put it in really broad sense, experimentation was something which was, it was almost a kind of unaccessible tool when I kind of came in to product managers, because a lot of the hub was born out of necessity. And so when you're moving in such a fast-paced market, you kind of make sure you make quick decisions at times to fulfill on a very specific need. And there was a very specific need at a point in time to do an experiment, and therefore using a tool that was lightweight and easy to implement, and that was the right thing to do, and it was engineering led. So for us to try and introduce that conversation into the product managers What we didn't want to have was a tool that was inaccessible to us. But equally, what we didn't want to do was start a piece of work that meant we were going to constantly reevaluate testing tools all the time, because you're constantly chasing your tail in doing that. So I think the first point there is that good growth allowed us to focus our attention on a conversation about experimentation. And so that we never had that before. Experimentation was something that was an afterthought, and it was I'm probably being too harsh there, but it was certainly not something that we considered first and foremost because of the overhead it took to do a simple experiment. So they allowed us to kind of have a specific moment in time, once a week, conversation about experimentation. So that's the first cultural change, because it meant there was a forum and a group of people who were discussing a very specific topic, and good growth were able to make sure that topic was facilitated and went in the right direction. And then when it came down to the more practical points, the experiments that we were running alongside upsell for Hub Plus is a good example, and experimenting with seeing whether we were getting better acquisition from certain positionings on the website of certain upsell messages. And we kind of always knew where we would get good traction. We always knew where that kind of acquisition tipping point was within inside our platform. Of we could sell a Love Island banner around upselling Hub Plus on the Love Island episode page, and that would see good traction because we could easily target that audience. Trying to bring in different ways of thinking about it, which weren't just kind of, in a sledgehammer way, and think, actually, what would happen if we remove this nav bar completely from this upsell page? Now, what would happen if we changed the order in which we advertised the benefits of Hub Plus on that same page as well? I think one challenge we've got in the industry is how you remove content and the success of content from that. So what I mean there is, if we experimented with inside Love Island week, we'd see a tremendous amount more traffic on the site. Now that would potentially skew the kind of the experiment. And content is always the challenge for us, is how we remove the specific success of a piece of content to determine the success of an experiment. So on the Hub, we've got what we call rails, or other people call them shelves. They are just ways that you can scroll left to right through content. And each content is obviously means something different to different people. So it's very difficult to say we're going to experiment with the order of this content inside here, because if you do that, you end up sort of trying to, you have to try and remove the popularity of that piece of content from there as well. So if Love Island was in slot 1 and we had a kind of ITV3 drama in slot 2, it's not to say that people are more interested in slot 1 than slot 2. It's maybe to say more people are interested in Love Island. So what good growth allowed us to try and do is sort of think about that challenge around how we can extrapolate content's kind of success from the experimentation that we were running, and think about it very much as leading metrics on the platform itself, as opposed to the success rate of content specific kind of programs.
Yeah, there's so many different variables there, I suppose, isn't there, in experimentation, and why you might be seeing the result that you're seeing. I just want to finish on looking ahead. We've seen that just even over the last 5 years, how quickly competitors come into the market, how quickly these streaming services adapt and change. How do you see perhaps broadly the market evolving over time, and ITV amongst it within that?
Well, I think just to start with ITV, I think we know, the evolution continues, and one thing we're very conscious of is our content depth when compared to competitors as well. So I think that's something that's obvious, and what we want to try and do is be a place where you would consider the ITV Hub as a destination for discovery of content. So if you're at home on a Friday, Saturday night, and you want to find something to watch on TV, we've got to be in consideration in your mind for that. And the way we go about doing that is to ensure that when you land on the product, that it's not just the content is there for you to watch, but you can discover, or you're kind of you're targeted with content that we think you're going to like. And so there's lots of different plays I've mentioned inside there then. So one is around the personalization experience and using recommendations to make sure that we target people in the right way at the right time. The second one is around how we kind of create an experience that allows for content to stand out. And there's various ways we can do that in terms of tagging and making sure we have rich components, or we have more visibility of the content at higher parts of the website that get more traction than the lower parts. And so we have lots of different platforms: iOS, Android, connected television, browser. We've got to think about all these user experiences because they're all very different. So watching on your phone is a very different user experience in probably a very different setting than compared to if you're watching in front of your TV with your family. So we've got to try and think about all these permutations of how content can be displayed. And for us, that's kind of where we are focused on, creating the discovery platform of ITV Hub and ensuring that we give the consumer the content they want to see, but also allow them to be aware of content that they don't know potentially exists on the hub as well. So that's kind of the direction of travel for ITV. In terms of where the kind of market's heading, I mean, I've got young children. I've got a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, 2 boys, and they've never really watched an ad-funded service. They don't really know adverts exist, and it becomes no more evident at Christmas time when you say, what do you want for Christmas? They've got absolutely no idea because they haven't consumed any adverts. And I pay for YouTube Premium, and I pay for it because the amount of YouTube and short form content they watch is phenomenal. And so, within the limits of what we let them, but they will just watch gaming video after gaming video of Minecraft. And if I didn't pay for that ad-free service, they would be bombarded constantly with adverts. So from their point of view, they're kind of growing up in a world that adverts doesn't exist, but they also don't appreciate the cost that's related into that experience. And it's similar with Amazon Prime as well. There's no kind of tangible cost related to them watching all of this content. And so I think, that's just kind of a very, very young demographic. And I think if that's kind of future direction, it's kind of fast, quick, consumable content that's uninterrupted. And that's what they thrive on, and so trying to sort of see how that is going to project into the future is kind of challenging because we've got platforms like TikTok now, which are kind of, less than a minute long of pieces of content, yet consume hours of people's time a day, and not in the creation and just the consumption. And so again, as a kind of young consumer, you're not aware of how that's actually funded. And I think that's kind of a danger in a certain sense. How do kind of people appreciate that their data is being used to fund that experience? And so the kind of scaremongering, pessimist in me is worried that the future looks more like, data revenue as opposed to kind of financial revenue or kind of AVOD services like ourselves. So I think, to try and make sure that we give an honest reflection around, and ITV have got that in abundance. We give an honest reflection about the revenue stream because we serve people with adverts, and there's a clear trade-off benefit inside there as well. So my kind of worry for the future is people don't appreciate the trade-off value they're making to consume content, and where that leads is scary. I think we can't get past looking at content which is generated kind of through automation and artificial intelligence. I think that again is a second sort of tier of targeting, which terrifies me to an extent as well, because I'm not sure it's going to potentially work, and the dangers of that could be huge. But in the immediate future, I see there is still a kind of content war going on in terms of acquisition. You just need to look at like the US office in America and how that bounces around between platforms because of the popularity. A few years ago, Friends was the most popular show on Netflix still. And so, these programs are still carrying huge amounts of weight and still are costing huge amounts of money as well. So I think there's still that kind of debate around, would anyone ever come in, truly aggregate all of this content? And the cost of that would be absolutely phenomenal to try and do as well. So I still think there's kind of 5 or so years left of the kind of content war. And then I think the future might shift in a completely different direction.
Yeah, fascinating thoughts. The point I'm hanging on to there is really I think the data revenue and the financial revenue, and see how that may shift over the next few years. Some brilliant insights there, Stu. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.